Hi, my name is David Kelsey, and today we're going to talk about rhetoric. So our approach to discussion of rhetoric is we'll be talking today about different types of rhetorical devices. And I think the way really to think about rhetoric is as a kind of persuasive tool or persuasive edge that you can add. And the way this persuasive edge is added is in virtue of language, right? And so if you think about language, there tends to be, with a lot of it, a kind of tone behind it, right? An emotive tone, if you will. And the idea is that some of the language we use has in itself a kind of ability to persuade, right? So we call because of this, we call rhetorical devices and rhetorical language, we call it a kind of slanter, because it can, just in virtue of the words used, it can slant someone's opinion, say, or beliefs on a matter, right? So for example, compare imagine that I was using some kind of language like hero. I could call someone a hero, right? And that's a kind of rhetorical way to put a positive, persuasive edge on a word like that. In a sense, you're trying to persuade that positively to influence about that individual that you're referring to as a hero. You're in a sense, just in virtue of that word alone, trying to persuade, right? Now imagine I called the same person a terrorist, right? There's a kind of negative tone to that word, right? Obviously. And so that's just sort of the power of rhetoric, right? Just in virtue of the words we choose, we can persuade, right? So the way that we'll go through these rhetorical devices is that they have these kinds of names, and so we'll be referring to these particular devices by their names, and then we'll kind of go through the discussion like that. But the key here is that with rhetoric, again, the point is that when language is used specifically for the purpose of persuasion, to influence, right? To influence someone's thinking or their beliefs or their attitude. This is when we're talking about rhetoric, right? Okay, so the first type of rhetorical device we have to discuss is called a rhetorical comparison, or sometimes it's called a rhetorical analogy. I think I've heard in the past this phrase of a simile, right? A simile is kind of the same thing. So this is just an expression used to refer to a comparison that's rhetorical, that's meant to influence, right? So, for example, we might, a good example would be to say something like, well, the boxer won the fight because his fists were like clubs of steel, or you might refer to your short friend as, well, she's as tiny as a little baby chihuahua, and so these are rhetorical comparisons, right? Comparisons that are meant to kind of influence and the way that you believe or think, right? Okay, so then the next type of rhetorical device is a rhetorical definition, right? So for example, I might define abortion as murder, right? I might say that abortion is the murder of an unborn child. That would be a rhetorical definition, right? And again, just like rhetorical comparison, this is a definition that's meant to influence. That's smuggling in a kind of persuasive tone, right? So this is a rhetorical definition. Next we have rhetorical explanation. And so this is just, again, an explanation that kind of smuggles in prejudice and bias and is meant to influence and persuade, right? So for example, I have the example here. You can imagine two fighters fighting a fight, and we might say the guy, he lost the fight because he was a chicken, right? That would be a type of rhetorical explanation, right? Okay, so now what we're going to talk about in the next set of slides here then is the idea of what's called a euphemism and also what's called a dysphemism. So euphemisms and dysphemisms in a general way are just words that have a positive or negative tone to them. So I used in the very beginning of this lecture, I used the idea of a hero and then compared that to the idea of a terrorist, right? So each of those two words have a kind of serious tone to them. And so this is the idea with a euphemism and a dysphemism. So first to the idea of a euphemism. A euphemism is just simply a word or phrase that has a kind of positive tone to it, an emotive tone that's positive as opposed to neutral or negative, right? One of my favorites here, is if you ever think about the candy that's distributed on Halloween that kids get, I've got two little ones, right? They get candy. Well, a lot of times they call these candies fun size, right? So fun size is a kind of euphemism for, essentially what those are is tiny little pieces of candy, like, barely a bite of candy. So they're called fun size. That's a euphemism to make them, sound a bit better than they really are, Another example that I really like is when I was a kid, they used to have, car lots that were called used car lots, and you would buy a used car, right? And so now, if you think about the way that the car sales industry, car industry goes, these aren't called used, these are called pre-owned now. And sometimes they're called certified pre-owned, right? And so the idea of something being pre-owned as opposed to used, that's a euphemism, right? And the interesting thing about that one there is that, of course, the purpose of calling it pre-owned instead of used is simply to get you to buy a car, right? That's the whole purpose behind it. So that's the effect of rhetoric, right? The persuasive edge, right? A lot of times, it's really interesting too if you follow, language and you follow the kind of way that people speak about things. And in particular what becomes politically correct, right? Or what is polite speak. It's interesting that a lot of times the euphemism will take the effect of becoming the sort of polite way to put things or the politically correct way to put things. So for example, if you're at somebody's funeral, right, and you're speaking to someone who's lost a loved one, you don't say, oh yeah, sorry, so-and-so's dead, right? You say, oh, sorry for your loss, or sorry they've passed, or they've gone to a better place. You say things like this, right? And these are kind of euphemisms, right, for for somebody dying, essentially, right? Another way to think about this is again with the idea of what's politically correct. A lot of times, a euphemism will take the place there as well. So think about 20 years ago, we would use a term like retarded, right? It wasn't a big deal, I don't think. But now using that phrase is kind of faded out, I guess, phased out. And I think we use more like something like disabled or challenged, right? Somebody's challenged or disabled. And these are have become essentially what's the correct way to put things, and yet they are, kind of like a euphemism, right? They put a positive tone on the disability, right? Now, a dysphemism is the next kind of rhetorical device we're going to discuss. And what a dysphemism does is the reverse of a euphemism, right? So a dysphemism is a negative way to put something as opposed to a positive way. So I have a couple good examples here. So say my buddy is just gone a little bit wild, he's having a great time, and we're partying, say, or something like that, and I say something like, he's nuts, he's crazy, he's a lunatic, right? He's out of control, stuff like this. And so these would be dysphemisms, right, to highlight the fact that he's getting a little bit too crazy that night, right? You can just put things a little bit more negatively, right? Another good example, I could call someone who needs to lose a little weight, right? I could say, oh, that person is overweight, or I could say something horrific like, oh, that's a fat cow, right? course, we don't really say that kind of stuff anymore, but that would be a dysphemism, kind of really bad dysphemism for calling someone overweight, right? So what you should see here really is that the words that we choose really mean a lot, you know? They mean a lot. Okay, the next rhetorical devices that we're going to look at now are stereotype, innuendo, and loaded question. Now, stereotype, I think everyone is pretty familiar with in general, right? Stereotypes are prejudices, biases toward an entire group of people, right? And I think the way to put what a stereotype is and what it does is that it's a kind of hasty generalization. So usually what happens with the stereotype is that, you know, maybe you see someone of a particular group doing something strange maybe, and then you see someone else doing the same thing from that group. And so you kind of generalize to the entire group doing that thing, you know. So for example, you see, say, some particular person driving erratically, and then you see another person from that same group, or, you know, that shares a trait with that first one, driving erratically as well. So you infer that everyone of that group drives erratically, right? And the problem with those kind of moves, right, is you can't really make a generalization to a whole group, a whole race or sex or you know, culture based upon what you see one or two of them do, right? It's just not enough evidence, right? And so that tends to be the problem with a stereotype, right? Usually what a stereotype does is it kind of denigrates or ridicules a group of individuals, you know. So for example, we could say something like Southerners generally are bigots, right? Or men are insensitive, right? And so these are kind of have a negative tone to them. But there are stereotypes that create a more favorable impression, right? So, you know, I've been playing soccer since I was very little, and, you know, I know that as a soccer person, fan, when you hear someone, for example, is Brazilian, you tend to think immediately that they can play soccer, you know? And so I think a lot of times what happens is you get these kind of favorable impressions created by stereotypes as well. But nevertheless, they're all kind of mistakes in reasoning, right? Based upon this idea that there's just not enough evidence generated to generalize to a whole group like that. The next type of rhetorical device we're going to look at is called innuendo. So an innuendo is kind of like saying something without literally saying it. It's kind of like underneath your words, you know. And so, for example, we might suggest, you know, someone is on time today. They're usually late by saying, "Oh, you're on time today, finally," you know, which means, you know, usually you're not on time, right? And a lot of times we can use innuendos to say something without really having to take responsibility or something like this, right? So for example, there's this kind of classic innuendo from W.C. Fields where he's eating a steak at a restaurant. It's like a bar. A long time ago, he says, I didn't say the meat was tough. I said, I didn't see the horse that's usually outside, right? And so what he's kind of implying there is that he's eating the horse, right? But he's not actually saying it. So this is kind of how innuendo works. It's like saying something without actually saying it. Okay, so the next one then is a loaded question. A loaded question is a type of innuendo because it kind of implies something without actually saying it. But it does that in virtue of a question, right? We sometimes call these rhetorical questions as well. Okay, so for example, you can imagine that there is a husband that's on trial for spousal abuse, right? He's on trial for spousal abuse, and the prosecuting attorney says to him, "Have you stopped beating her?" Right? So this would be a rhetorical or loaded question. So essentially, what happens is if he answers that question, right, then he's of course admitting guilt, right? And that's the thing with that one is that you can't really, you know, if you're a prosecutor, you can't just kind of, you know, ask a question in virtue of, you know, trying to prove essentially the case, you know, that he's abusing his wife, right? He needs, of course, evidence for that and all of that. So another example would be, imagine that you get pulled over by a police officer, and you're speeding or something, and the officer says to you, "We're going to speed like that the whole way home," And then, of course, if you answer yes or no, either way, you're sort of admitting guilt. So that's what we call a loaded question. It's kind of like a question that really assumes something it's not supposed to assume, right? Okay, so the next group of rhetorical devices that we're going to look at today is Weaseler, downplayer, and proof surrogate. So a Weaseler is kind of like it sounds. It's a way to weasel out of criticism. And it's a kind of word or phrase that it sort of offers the author of the claim a way to weasel out of for example, an objection or a counter argument or some kind of reply to the claim. So what a Weaseler does is kind of waters a claim down or weakens it without really looking like it's doing that, right? So for example, you might say something like, perhaps he was lying, right? So instead of saying, oh yeah, he was lying, right? Maybe he was, which kind of implies, right? It gets this kind of idea in your mind, well, maybe he was, A really good example, Weaselers will often come, for example, I see them a lot in advertisements for prescription drugs or diet ads. So you might see, for example, a diet ad that says something like, you could lose as many as 20 pounds, right? And the could there, right? Essentially what the could does, that's the Weaseler, it means essentially that you might not lose any, right? And so it kind of weakens that claim to essentially mean really nothing, right? Here's another good example with a couple Weaselers. So the claim here, imagine you get this kind of advertisement which says, 3 out of 4 dentists surveyed recommend sugarless gum for their patients who chew gum, right? Now when you read this kind of statement, it looks like a kind of bold, assertive recommendation for chewing gum, but when you read into it more, it's got these 2 Weaselers in it, which actually, what happens when you kind of inspect the Weaselers, it kind of reduces this claim to meaningless. So the first Weaseler in this claim is surveyed, right? So understand that this isn't 3 out of 4 dentists, this is 3 out of the 4 guys that were surveyed. So for all we know, it could just be 4 dentists, which would mean very little. But next, look at the phrase, who chew gum here, right? So this says that, essentially this is a recommendation for patients to chew gum for those that do already chew gum or that are deciding, what kind to chew given they already do, right? So this isn't a recommendation for anyone to chew gum. This is just for gum chewers to chew sugarless kind, right? Now, of course, if you think about what sugarless gum is and how sugar is bad for the teeth, right? Of course, if you're going to chew gum, you should chew sugarless gum, right? So this is essentially a claim that really means very little, right? You read it though, and it's really interesting because it sounds kind of like an important claim, a recommendation for gum chewing, but it's really not. Okay, so the next rhetorical device is what we call a downplayer. Okay, so a downplayer downplays the significance or importance of something. It makes it look less important, right? So I think a really good example, there's a few that we have here. The quotation marks are a way to downplay something. So for example, say I was a big fan of UCLA and I didn't like USC, right? I might say about my buddy's degree from USC that it was a degree, right, in whatever he got his degree in, because I'm sort of, in a certain sense, I'm saying that it's not really a degree at all, right? It's a degree, which is kind of like not a degree. Another good example of a downplayer is the phrase so-called. So for example, I might say of a chiropractor, right, that's a so-called doctor, which essentially means they're not really a doctor at all, So these are downplayers. The next rhetorical device we're going to look at is called proof surrogate. So proof surrogate is a kind of expression, a phrase that is meant to persuade you into thinking that there's some sort of statistic or fact or piece of evidence that backs a claim when there isn't really any citation given. So for example, if I said, oh yeah, studies show that eating McDonald's every day is the most healthy way you could live, right? Sounds like an absurd type of claim, right? The studies show there would be the proof surrogates, right? Like I'm suggesting that there's a real scientific study out there to back that kind of claim when there really isn't, you know? Okay, so then I think the last two here, rhetorical devices that we're going to look at, are probably two of the most widely used. The first is ridicule, and the second is hyperbole. So ridicule is kind of like it sounds. It's essentially like laughing at someone or at someone's expense. You know, my favorite example of a ridicule is if you've ever watched the show The Simpsons, kind of a classic cartoon, right? You have this character on there called Nelson, and Nelson will a lot of times will go, heh, heh, you know, and he'll point at someone and kind of laugh. Right, that's as simple as a ridicule gets, right? It's just laughing at someone's expense, and so that's what a ridicule does. Is it kind of just gets a laugh at someone's expense, and of course, it's meant to be a kind of persuasive tool, right? And of course, just laughing at someone is no argument. You know, it's no reason to think that what they say or what they do is in any way, say, false, for example, right? And so that's the idea of ridicule. And I think a lot of times when you see someone telling a joke about someone, for example, that's what we take a ridicule to be, putting somebody down, all of that. And a lot of times people do that, as a kind of persuasive means. And, just the point is that really, there's no logical reason behind, just telling a joke at someone's expense, right? It's just rhetoric. The next one here, I think the last one for the slide, is hyperbole. So hyperbole is sort of exaggeration, but it's like super exaggeration, And basically, the idea again is that it's meant to persuade this hyperbole, right? It's meant to actually try to influence your beliefs in virtue of the kind of exaggeration that you're telling. So, for example, I stub my toe and I say that I'm about to die, right? Or I have a friend that's kind of annoying, and I say you're the most annoying person in the world, So these are kind of like ways to be hyperbolic, right? Just boost the effect of a claim by sort of over exaggerating it, right? A lot of times we can just do that too in virtue of like the way that we put things, like the sound, the tone, and so on. So this is called hyperbole, and so this will be the last rhetorical device for the lecture, and hope you enjoyed it, right? And again, the bottom line sort of with these devices is that the language we use can often be used as a tool to persuade, to influence, and so that's the idea with rhetoric, and we just have to be aware of the rhetorical devices that we see and that we hear so that we don't sort of fall prey to their persuasion, right? Okay, well, hope you enjoyed that. Have a good one, and we'll see you next time.